some of them have achieved this like outsized wealth. But I never found that it was the thing that was the driver, because, in a funny way, if it was the driver, they would have lived very different lives after PayPal. Because after PayPal, a few of these folks had enough wealth where they could have just sort of like, moved to a beach and lived out their days. They continue to invest to support each other, to find promising new people, right? And then support them along the way.
My guest today is Jimmy Soni. Jimmy is an award-winning author. His previous book, A Mind at Play, How Claude Shannon Invented the Information Age, has won numerous awards. His latest book is The Founders, the story of PayPal and the entrepreneurs who shaped Silicon Valley. Today, PayPal's founders and earliest employees are considered the technology industry's most powerful network. Since leaving PayPal, they have formed, funded, and advised the leading companies of our era, including Tesla, Facebook, YouTube, SpaceX, Yelp, Palantir, and LinkedIn, among many others. I recently sat down with Jimmy and we talked about how the seeds of so much of what shapes our world today were planted 2 decades ago at PayPal and changed our world forever. Jimmy, thanks so much for coming on the show. I greatly appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much for having me and for taking time to read the book. And it's not a short read, so I appreciate you doing this.
Oh, my pleasure, man. The name of the book, folks, is The Founders, the story of PayPal and the entrepreneurs who shaped Silicon Valley. And Jimmy, is there a book anywhere, anything close to this? Like describing, no, you're describing 4 years. I think it was 98 to 2002. Is that right?
Yeah, okay. 98 to 02.
Of PayPal and this amazing group of people that have shaped our world over the past 20 years that all came out of this PayPal environment. Is there anything like it?
Yeah. I'll be honest, like there are other clusters, right? So in fiction, right, the cluster I've heard referenced most often is the Avengers, right? Because it's kind of like you got Elon Musk and Peter Thiel and Reid Hoffman and Max Levchin all in one company, David Sachs, the founders of YouTube, founders of Yelp. So outside of fiction, in Silicon Valley, you have Fairchild Semiconductor, Xerox PARC, General Magic. Those are the famous clusters. On the East Coast, you have Bell Labs, right, which is like a famous innovation cluster. But no one had really gone back, to my surprise. I mean, my market research for this book, Charles, was me going on Amazon and seeing if the book was available for purchase. And when I found that no one had done it, it just, you find things, they bother you. My theory of my books is always like there's an empty space on a bookshelf, and like it just bugs me that it's empty and I have to fill it. But no one had really gone back. There have been books on Peter Thiel, there have been books on Elon Musk, and there have been books generally on Silicon Valley. Reid Hoffman has written his own books, but no one had gone back and really excavated this 1998, just this period. And the honest reason might be that someone writing about like rockets and electric cars probably has easier material to work with, but that's like the later life, right? So you're kind of like going back and asking these people about some of the most earliest things they did, some of the most certainly less interesting, maybe relative to space travel, but everyone's got to do something. Right. That was what I decided to do.
I just want to read something from your book, which really just will frame our whole conversation. And I learned so much from this about it. And I do remember, you mentioned X.com. I do remember advertisements for that. I remember I had a bill payment service. I forgot the name of it. I think it was Check Free that I was using in the late 80s. And I saw that, I'm not jumping ahead yet. Let me just read something from your book, which just knocked me off my seat. If you had used the internet at all in the last 20 years, you've touched a product, service, or website connected to the creators of PayPal, the founders of several of our era's defining firms, the creators of YouTube, Yelp, Tesla, SpaceX, LinkedIn, Palantir, among others, were early PayPal employees. Others occupy top posts at Google, Facebook, and Silicon Valley's leading venture capital firms. Astounding.
Yeah, it astounded me that all of this talent basically worked at one company for this very tight during this very tight window, and then they all went on to do this other thing. And so the thesis of the book, the big question for me was, well, what was in the water? This is like an even more elite group than like the Harvard, right? Or some tiny little like Rhodes scholars. Like this, you don't even get this level of the small number of people and the huge things they did once they left. So I wanted to find out what happened there, right? Because it was what they did after was so well covered. Someone had to go back and ask them what happened in those years.
But it's like some of them who left, the smaller guys only made $2-3 billion of their personal net worth, and then you have on the other extreme, Elon Musk in the hundreds of billions of dollars, and everyone in between.
Yeah, and it's also interesting. The folks who, another good example of an alum, there's this website called Kiva.org. Kiva.org is a micro lending website. It basically took this very abstract concept of micro lending and it brought it down to the masses. It mainstreamed it. The founder of that was an early PayPal employee. PayPal was a job that he took. He had a friend who was at Stanford. He got hired, and he brought a lot of the PayPal principles into the creation of Kiva.org, right? The woman today who is the CEO of Ancestry.com, and Ancestry.com is a site a lot of people know. They know it's advertising. Their mission is to collect the world's genealogical records. She got hired at PayPal in these early years. The ambassadors, the advisor to Arnold Schwarzenegger, like the communications advisor to Arnold Schwarzenegger for when he was governor, was a PayPal alum. If you've watched a YouTube video, the 3 co-founders of YouTube came out of this group. And what I discovered in going back and talking to them is that it wasn't accidental. They learned things during this experience that they carried forward into all of those other experiences. So I had this hypothesis, right, which was maybe you all learned something here as a part of this that you would carry forward. And it turned out the answer was yes.
Yeah, and what I found amazing was you had such large personalities. First of all, the IQ were off the chart. So you had the smartest of the smartest people all getting together, and we'll discuss in a minute how Musk and Peter Thiel came together, and how Levchin, am I pronouncing it?
It's Levchin.
Levchin, Ukrainian immigrant. How Levchin came, couldn't believe what he was, just was number 1 or 2 guy with Peter Thiel, and his brilliance. They didn't think they would do anything amazing. It was like solving puzzles and problems. It was like fun. It was part of their day, But what I found amazing, and I want to talk about this, was they saw with PayPal, they saw an opportunity. They saw a change of the world happening with the internet, like Jeff Bezos did. He saw the internet growing. He said, I got to get on this bandwagon. I'll do it with books. When they saw the internet, they were able to connect finance, putting banks out of business the way we know them, all in one sweet spot and say, that's the 20th century. We're moving forward.
Yeah, I would take a step back and say, PayPal is really the fusion of 2 companies. It's Elon's company, X.com, and Peter and Max's company, Confinity. What you said about seeing the internet as this transformative force in finance, that is definitely true for Elon. So Elon doesn't want to just have this company satisfy payments between you and me, right? Meaning we go to lunch, I owe you $20, I PayPal you $20. That was one small part of a very big vision that he had that was called X. That company was called X.com. And the idea was the internet is going to change everything. It's going to make it easier for you and I to do everything. So why is it that my mortgage has to live in one place and my banking has to live in another and my index funds have to live somewhere else? Why can't all of that come under one roof? For a couple important reasons. One, why should there be fees if I move money around? 2, why should it take so much time, like wire transfers and waiting days and this and that and delays? And then number three, all of your money being in those separate places also leaves holes open for fraud, for theft, et cetera. These databases are insecure in Elon's description of them. So his idea was, I want to consolidate all of that, because what the internet has done is it's made it possible to do that. That's his vision. The Confinity vision, which is Peter Thiel and Max Levchin's, is much, much narrower. And the idea there is, you and I both have the hot device of the 1990s, the Palm Pilot.
And by the way, I still have, when I was reading this, I was a big Palm Pilot guy. And when you needed to buy a stylus, Staples only sold them in 3-packs. So if you lost one, you had to buy 3. And I got so many packages, I think still unopened, because I said, let me buy a few. And those stylus and the infrared and all that. But go ahead. I'm sorry to interject. But it was a Palm Pilot.
Confinity's vision. It was to take these Palm Pilot devices, these early PDAs, and use the infrared ports so that if you and I are at lunch and I owe you $20, we can stick the infrared ports next to each other and beam each other money. So the two companies have actually very different visions, different goals, a whole different way they're going to make money. They chance into becoming what PayPal is today, meaning that their initial success for both companies comes in the form of emailing money. And so it was the case that your description of the big, expansive, change the world of finance vision, that was Elon's vision for his half of the company. But it's fair to say that for Confinity, for Max and Peter and their team, the initial vision was slightly narrower.
Yeah, they just wanted to get money from A to B using the internet. Email was the most, was most efficient, and it made the most sense. And everyone had an email account. I think you mentioned that at Palm Pilots, there are only 5 million of them. And so if you had to be in a restaurant with your friends who also had Palm Pilots outside of Silicon Valley, I don't know how often that was the case, because it was a very closed system.
It was a closed system, but it's interesting, you and I can say that 20 years, at a 20-year remove, right, from the comfort of like where we are today. At the time where they were, Palm Pilots were all the rage.
Wait, hang on
right?
a second. I had a Palm Pilot, and I also had a Case, and I had Act, which was a contact management software, and I had all of my contacts on there, and later on, when you were able to make phone calls, it was so buggy. The Palm Pilot was just so buggy, but I loved the idea of carrying everything with you in one place and being able to access it. You're right. 20 years later, for someone who's 30 years old, has no idea what I'm talking about. But mailing a check, sometimes there were 14-day holds, 10-day holds. Did you get the check? Did you deposit the check? The check would bounce. There were so many things. It wasn't anywhere near instantaneous. But I think the brilliance of these guys is what bothers me, what doesn't bother me, I'm not a genius like them, is I lived through this and I saw the same thing they saw, but they came up with solutions and I saw problems. And, I was living through this, and I remember using check free in the late 80s, which was automatically paying my bills through the bank, because my wife, and I'll tell you a quick story on that, my wife used to sit on our bed, Indian style, and have all of the bills out in front of her writing checks each month. I said, honey, this got to stop. This is ridiculous. You're mailing, I'm just not getting it. I want to see what we paid. I found check free, I think it was 88 or 89, and then we started paying everything automatically, and I saw the power of that. But these guys took it to the next level.
They definitely did. And, and it wasn't easy. They fell in love with the Palm Pilot technology, the money beaming, and they had to be, pushed by their board, by friends, by advisors, also by David Sachs, who joined the team. And his line about it is, I wanted to put a bullet in the Palm Pilot thing. I thought this was the future, but it wasn't going to be the present. And what was going to work in the present was going to be emailing money. And so it was not that they were foresighted. They just moved very rapidly once they discover that people are into emailing. It's funny you identified the bugginess. of the Palm Pilots because I went back and I looked at Palm Pilot for Dummies. Like, look, oh, yeah, where am I going to find a Palm Pilot today? Like in a museum.
Oh, I have
right?
one.
So,
No, I have my old one. It's literally we saved. My son saved all of our old phones, and you go back. It looks like it's a museum. It's like we have a whole shoebox of all of these old things, and we had the Palm Pilot, and there was a handspring also.
If you handspring, the handspring visor.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. My son had the handspring visor. At 10 years old, we bought him that. It was a joke.
Yeah, it's funny. So I was reading this guide, and it actually said that when the infrared ports debuted, they had this funny issue. If you held them too far apart, the beam didn't travel. But if you held them too close, the beam didn't work. So you had to have this like Goldilocks sweet spot for the beaming, right? And it was buggy as anything. And when I was looking around, the only real use case I found was this person who wrote this like lengthy piece of code for how you could use the Palm Pilots to play Battleship. But otherwise, like nobody had really figured out what you were going to use this for. They did. They created mobily encrypted transactions. And, you know, we can laugh at it today, but that is what Venmo is, right? Which, funny enough, is owned by PayPal. But the idea of mobile technology being the future, both Max and Elon could see that coming, right? One of the reasons that Elon is excited about the name X.com, the way he explained it to me, because that name has been parodied in the aftermath of all this. He said, listen, if you're on a device that's an index card wide and you need to get to your entire financial life, everything, X.com is only 5 buttons that you have to press, as opposed to something like bankofamerica.com, right? Which is like, you're going to get, your thumbs are going to get tired. His view, and he was right, was that people are going to be walking around with supercomputers in their pockets. Max's view, which was also eventually proven right, was that people are going to be walking around with supercomputers in their pockets. The mobile part of these companies' early history, or the mobile thinking, is probably just 10 or 20 years too early. But you're spot on that they foresaw the future in that way. But the reality of the company became this much narrower thing, which was around emailing money.
Right. There's one line in here that you put, I forget who said it, but it doesn't matter here, about Elon Musk. When he articulates something, he tends to find the kernel that will appeal to a broad mass intuitively. And he's taken that to Tesla.
Yeah. You know, it's one of the interesting things that I discovered in the course of researching this book. We tend to think, particularly, I think those of us who are not engineers, we sort of like look at engineers and we're like, you have some special knowledge that I don't have. You know, you know something I don't know. In his case, that's true. He knows a lot about physics and about rocket engineering that I don't know. But what I found about him that was interesting is that his command of the language is really facile and elegant. Like he uses metaphors and imagery in a way that's very compelling. And so, you know, sometimes he does it for comedic effect. And it's like, we've all seen that play out on Twitter and elsewhere. But the interesting thing about him is the number of employees that I interviewed who said, you know, the reason I joined the company is because of the vision that he painted about us taking on Goldman Sachs, or us taking on JP Morgan, or us taking on the Federal Reserve. That imagery, that ability to paint that story, I don't think you can discount that. I don't think we should underrate it, because it is actually what allows you to recruit. It's what allows you to raise money. And it is what gives people a vision of the future they can get excited about. He does all of those things today. And I think we're too quick to say, oh, that's just crazy, or no, that doesn't, you know, that ability, that gift is a real gift. And I think we should see it as such.
Yeah, you mentioned in the book that he has people calling him to work with him, and he has nothing. There's no company. There's no product. There's just an idea. But they meet with him, and they're just so overwhelmed with his ballsy attitude of, well, copy the website, make it look like Schwab. Use blue color. That's why they use blue color. His vision wasn't, you know, 1 foot hurdles. He wanted to create, I want to be as big as, I'm going to be bigger than Schwab. I'm going to be bigger than Goldman Sachs.
And one of the most amazing things in the story that's never really been covered before is that almost isn't in an early iteration of the company, almost the entire executive team quits. Between that period and when the product is launched is basically 15, 16 weeks. So within the space of 16 weeks or thereabouts, he manages to get Barclays Bank and a bank in the United States to sign up with X.com. They build a functional product. They hire a team, engineers, business strategists, and others. and they get launched by Thanksgiving. This is after he loses his entire executive team. He still wills it into existence. So this belief that a lot of his colleagues have in him comes from a very genuine place. They see it happen where he will say something, things will get executed. Sure, it's frenzied and people are working around the clock and a lot of people are tired and sometimes frustrated. But when an ATM spits out money 4 months after he says we're going to have debit cards, these people have something to look to say, we can do this. Yeah. We can actually take on Goldman Sachs. We can take on JP Morgan. It's not going to be perfect, but we're going to get there.
You know, you relate how they go on Thanksgiving or so when they go to the ATM, they're all standing there and he puts in his X.com debit card and out comes money and they all cheer. It's like amazing. Amazing.
It's one of my favorite photos in the book, was shared with me by someone who worked there. His name is Seshu Kanuri. And Seshu kept this photo forever. And it's Elon at the ATM smiling about his, like he looks like a kid on Christmas morning, and he's holding the cash and he's holding the ATM card. And I think, you know, again, it's easy for us to look at this and look at the photo and maybe laugh or smile. But if you take a step back and think about the fact that this 20-something decided in the summer of 2000 that he was going to build a company that had a relationship with a bank so they could do credit cards, so that he could do debit cards, so you could get cash. And then weeks later it was done. I mean, that's astounding.
You know what I found also interesting, and I want to move off Musk because there's so much ink spilt on him. I want to talk about the other guys. You know, it's like it's literally walk into the Hall of Fame. There are just so many great players there. When he comes up with the idea to make this happen, I found it to be like it wasn't such a big idea. Well, I couldn't say a big idea. It was his force of will that makes it happen through all the adversities. And I think the fact that he's willing to put up his money, his own money, he doesn't care about that. He has $21 million from a prize sale. He sleeps under the desks like everyone else in a sleeping bag. He improvises. He knows coding when coding's needed. But what fascinated me, and which permeates throughout his whole life, is he first works at a bank that you put in here, which I had no idea about. He finds an arbitrage opportunity that can make billions of dollars with the Brady bonds and the defaulting Latin American debt. Figures it out, goes to his superiors. It was the Royal Bank of...
it was a Scotia Bank. It was a Bank of Nova Scotia.
Right, Bank of Nova Scotia in Canada. He says, here it is. And they say, nah, we got burnt with too much of other things. And that gives them the thing is, big companies are slow and they won't innovate.
Yeah, it's interesting to me that in so many ways, the Elon of today is the Elon of age 19. So I had the good fortune of meeting his first and maybe his only ever boss, this gentleman named Peter Nicholson. And Dr. Nicholson is this just like hugely like a big brain, really, really smart guy. And he meets this young kid named Elon Musk and he hires him as an intern. And
by the way, just
Dr.
hang on
Nicholson,
a second. Just hang on. How did Elon get that job? He had the balls to go ahead, you tell it.
He found a newspaper article about Dr. Nicholson, thought he was interesting, pestered, I think, the reporter until he got his phone number, called him, and basically like talked his way into lunch with him in Canada. And Dr. Nicholson, by the way, he like worked in politics. He was a big-ish deal, right? But Elon doesn't know anybody. He's going to cold call until he gets it. I get cold call, not email at that time. So he gets this meeting, talks his way into the gig, right? And Dr. Nicholson, it was interesting talking to Dr. Nicholson because they've stayed in touch, but Dr. Nicholson's not anybody who is, you know, he's a great mentor in that he sort of has pride in what his mentee has done, but he's not in Elon's business every day. So Dr. Nicholson had a bunch of great chats with me. And one of the things he said is he's like, you know, even at that age, you could tell this was somebody who was really precocious, but also just like really wanted to get things, like was really aggressive, like wanted to get things done. Meaning when he came up with this proposal to like basically try their luck at this arbitrage opportunity, you know, he was really like gung ho about it. He was like, we have to do this. And he was 19. He was there for, you know, he's an intern. And so to me, it reveals so much about how his character today is the same, meaning when there's a logical way to get to an endpoint, he wants to get there very, very quickly. And again, I think that's an admirable quality. I'm
Yeah.
sure it makes life hard for some of the people who work for him, but he has a conviction that I don't think you'll find in American business.
Right. I had on the show Tim Higgins, who wrote the book Power Play. Wall Street Journal reporter, wrote about Elon Musk and Tesla. And I asked him, I said, how come the big auto manufacturers couldn't come up with this? They had the capacity, they had the production. He goes, because they don't innovate. It's a job killer. And Musk saw this as an opportunity that he could do an end run around them. And, reading this book, finding out how we saw that from the beginning where banks were not innovative, you don't need to come up with a new mousetrap. Just your competition is lumbering. Just attack and come up with something better and quicker.
And, he even says there's a great quote in the book about, he says, when you start out, your idea is going to be mostly wrong. And you engage in what, in that quote, he calls it recursive self-improvement. So he says, even when you do a startup, you're mostly wrong at the beginning. And you just refine the idea until you do something that is productive and creates value for other people, because that is what a company is supposed to do. Right. And so to my mind, this is sort of linked. It's like there's a conviction about the future, but there's also this sense that you're going to start out and fail a lot. And that is a piece of this too, is that it's not just that you see the vision, it's that you have a capacity to endure what are going to be multiple failures along the way. And I think part of what I hope the book does is illustrate that in terms that are more than just cliches, meaning people will actually see the failures that they face along the way, whether that's operational, financial, personnel wise. But it's a very real thing to have to constantly fix, tweak, and move very, very quickly, all while the dollars in the bank account are running down, because you're not a company that has consistent revenue coming in. You are just trying to build a new thing from scratch.
Right. You have a burn rate, and every day you're there, we have enough money for 5 months. If this gets done in 6, we're out of business.
Yep, that's right. And he feels that really keenly, and he has had that success with Zip2 and he sells it and makes some money, but it's not the case that he decides he's going to sit on a beach. He takes most of that fortune and invests it in his next venture. And so I think there's a risk-taking part of this that's also part of it. And I would say that what I just described, the qualities I just described about Musk, just to not make this all about Elon, it fits the bill for plenty of these people, meaning there's an appetite for moving very quickly. There's a rapid rate of learning, and there's a willingness to take risks that you wouldn't take in ordinary business, right? But then to just adjust as reality hits you in the face.
So you know what? Let's go back to the beginning. It's 1998. The process for getting amazing people, they're really high barriers to entry. You just can't work and apply there. Walk us through that, because right off the bat, they're starting with a subset of brilliant people who all have kind of the same drive, same motivation, different talents, but there's a lot of commonality amongst them.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing to look back at the recruiting, because I went in and I thought, oh, okay, they're these people, they're so exalted, they're so successful, they're so smart. Surely they had their pick of the top talent in Silicon Valley. And it turned out actually kind of like the opposite. So when Confinity, which is Peter and Max's company, is recruiting, they're competing against Google and Yahoo and Netscape and the big, quote unquote, big players of the internet. So in a funny way, they're actually at a huge disadvantage. They end up having to recruit people who they know through friend networks or through contacts or people they went to college with, not because that made for the best team, but because it was the only people they could actually hire and recruit were these people who they knew and were, old friends. That has the virtue of self-selecting for a group of really smart, really talented people. And then they add some additional hurdles. One of the things that they do early in the interview process is they throw these really esoteric puzzles at them, right? So you've got 2 ropes, each one burns for an hour, right? How do you use that to calculate 45 minutes, right? Which ends of the rope do you light and in what order do you light them? There's things like that were so natural to them that would be not, the thing that you I wouldn't get excited about solving a puzzle like that. I think it would, it might stretch my capacities that was a part of the place, right? Puzzle solving was a big, big thing in the room. I found 4 years of the weekly newsletter for the company. Every week there was a puzzle. And the only thing you earned was bragging rights. The next week I would look at, like, I'd flip from one issue of the newsletter to the other, and the names of the people who got the problem right were listed, like, as like, hey, this person got it right. And I could tell it was like, you'd see the same names over and over again. These are people who are clearly like waiting for the next puzzle, right? But it was a part of the play, that kind of problem solving, where problem solving isn't something you do because you have to do it. It's something you do because you want to do it, was actually a part of the culture.
Right, right. So what I got out of this was Peter Thiel's amazing managerial skills and brilliance, which it really attracts people to him. He knows how to put all the pieces in place.
Yeah, it's one of the things that I think we miss about him, because it's easy to miss. So I interviewed a lot of people who, where Peter was their boss. And what I heard over and over again, almost like in an eerily similar way, right? Where I was like, at some point I had to say, like, are you guys all reading from the same song sheet? Like, what is this? And what they would say to me is, he's not the manager who's going to be talking to you every day and making you feel great. But what he is exceptionally good at is finding incredibly talented people that maybe the rest of the world disregarded for some reason, and then giving them so much rope, but setting very high expectations for what they could do and making them believe that they could do it. So there was a person who, his name is Roelof Botha. Today, Roelof Botha is the head of Sequoia Capital, right? One of the biggest venture capital firms in the world. He's a big deal in Silicon Valley, widely respected and admired. When he joins the team at PayPal, he's 25. He's a part-time employee, then becomes a full-time employee. And by age 26, Peter has named him CFO. And Peter's board at PayPal says, you can't have a 26-year-old CFO. We're going to take the company public. And the way John Malloy, who's the board member, put it to me, he said, Wall Street's going to eat this kid alive. Mm-hmm. Like, you don't take a company public with a 26-year-old CFO. Peter pushes back and says, no, Roelof is brilliant. He understands the business cold. He's built the Excel model that basically drives the business. We have to go public. He's the person we're taking and doing this. And John Malloy said that one of his only regrets from the PayPal years is that he did not have more faith that Peter was right about that decision.
Really?
But I saw that decision repeat itself over and over and over again. The board says, you can't name Reid Hoffman COO. He's not the kind of guy who's going to be a taskmaster. He's really friendly. And Peter says, no, I need a COO who's a diplomat right now because we're starting to interface with all these people. Rebecca Eisenberg's an attorney. She's just lost her job. He brings her in. He makes her first chair on the IPO. And she says, I can't believe Peter gave me this kind of faith. Even people that were hired by Elon Musk, Peter empowers them to go do some of the best work of their careers. There is something about this. And I think the book will capture the stories. I'm not sure I have any kind of grand theory for why he's good at this. But I think one of his talents in this story for this period is identifying people and saying, go, I trust you and you're going to do the right thing.
Earlier on in the book, before he starts, I think about the time he starts his hedge fund called Thiel Capital, Ken Howery, a Stanford senior from Texas, goes over and chats briefly with him. And I love the way you put this. The two met for dinner at a steakhouse in Palo Alto to talk things over. Several hours into the dinner, Howery was impressed, not just by Thiel's depth of knowledge, but also by his range. Howery returned to his dorm and said to his girlfriend, Peter might be the smartest person I've met in my 4 years at Stanford. I think I might work for him for the rest of my life. How many people, I'd have never, that's just absolutely amazing that you meet someone that smart that just knocks you off your chair where you say, I want to work for this guy. This guy's brilliant.
And they've been, so far as I know, working together ever since he had that reflection as a college senior. And so Ken Howery is highly involved at PayPal. He is highly involved and one of the first real leaders at Founders Fund, which is one of the venture capital firms that emerges from this group, and has been involved intimately in this orbit ever since. So his prediction proved true, not for like 5 years, but for 20. I mean, it proved true. It was true for 20 years. I think that the other thing that I found in this story, which many people I think may miss about him, but that people within Silicon Valley know pretty well, is that once he has taken one bet on you, whether or not that bet works out, Peter will go to bat for the person that he's invested in time and time again. So Peter is some of the earliest money in all of the companies we talked about from the beginning, meaning like all those companies that emerged from this particular seed group at PayPal. Peter or one of Peter's like friends or affiliates are often some of the earliest investors, and Peter is he's one of the biggest champions for these people later. I heard all these stories, like somebody would tell me like they'd have some idea for a restaurant and Peter had supported something they'd done before. And Peter was like, great, I'll invest, whatever happens, right? Restaurants like famously money losing businesses, right? He goes to bat for people again and again in their careers. Once you have passed a certain threshold where you're in his orbit, I don't think that this side of him has been well covered in the past. And I didn't know one way or the other. I didn't have an opinion. All I heard were things that were played back to me over the course of hundreds of interviews with people where they said, boy, he placed a bet on me that I would not have placed on myself. Right. And that's actually like the most remarkable thing is even Max Levchin in later interviews said, one of the things that Peter did was he made me believe I could be a CTO, like I could actually do this. And that like they gave me enough confidence to get through like one more night of coding or like 2 more weeks of difficulty. I think of that. I mean, that's the essence of leadership.
Where did he get his first money? Like he started his hedge fund, Thiel Capital, and it was a couple $100,000. Was I reading that right? It wasn't too much.
My understanding of it, and I didn't go into the early, I went only a little bit into the early history of Thiel Capital, which is the first hedge fund that he starts. So Peter's story is, he's a huge success academically at Stanford. He goes to Stanford Law School, is a huge success academically there. And once you do well at Stanford, the next natural step is you get an appellate court clerkship. He goes and does that. And then you're sort of, you're headed to the Supreme Court clerkship pool, right? And that's kind of the high watermark of what you can do as a law student. He doesn't get the Supreme Court clerkship. And he has to decide then, as he put it to me and has put it in other places, he had a quarter life crisis. He had to figure out what to do with his life, right? I think fortunately for him and for many of the people in this story, he ends up going back out west to become a technology investor. And his first investments, I mean, he's not anybody that people know, right? We say his name today, but we have to remember this is like 1996, 1997, 1998. He's just a guy named Peter who has left the law and spent some time at a hedge fund, right? And is investing his money that he raises from friends and family. He starts to do some startup investing, and it's kind of in that era, this is the height of the dot-com boom. A lot of people are investing in startups, and Peter's one of many. But even within that group, he makes investments. One of his first investments is a $100,000 bridge loan to a young kid named Max Levchin, who has graduated from the University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana. And that company that he invests in is the company that becomes PayPal. And so I can't tell you how much assets under management he had, but I can tell you about one of the bets he placed in this moment that proved to be hugely successful later. And Peter ends up becoming the CEO of that company.
Right. He raised money from friends and family to launch a hedge fund in 96. So it couldn't be a lot of money, and it focused on global macroeconomic strategy and currency investing. 2 years later, he looks for his firm and then he goes on. So it can't be a lot of money that he has.
No,
which is,
and I don't, and to be honest, like, I think he basically launched a hedge fund, but the funds would have been small because he wasn't anybody that people looked at and said, oh, that's, there's your next Warren Buffett. Like, this is a person who like left New York hedge fund and law world, moved back out west, and was starting to make his.
He had no credits as a West Coast guy. He worked, Credit Suisse. He leaves, he goes west. He doesn't have any kind of pedigree. They don't, in terms of success in Silicon Valley, they don't know this. He didn't work for, Gordon Moore or anyone,
But I do think that there's this one thing that he has that people will often miss. You have to remember, he's sitting with Max Levchin when Max is 21, 22. Max has a really difficult time at that moment in his life looking people in the eye when he's talking to them. So I had this discussion with Reid Hoffman, and Reid said for the first 45 minutes of meeting Max Levchin, all Max Levchin could do was look at his shoes, and Reid just kept saying in his own head, like, look up. Why won't you look up at me? Right? Peter meets Max and they bond over math. They bond over a certain competitiveness about math. And I think Peter recognized like this is somebody who's really talented, right? Like really, really talented. With Ken Howery, one of the things Peter said to me is, Ken has the ability to be the smartest person in a room, but nobody thinks he's the smartest person in the room, which is a really good quality because he can get along with anyone, but no one looks at him and is intimidated by him, which is really, again, a sort of a superpower. With Luke Nosek, who's another key figure, Peter had said to me, this is in my interviews with him, he said, Luke's a visionary. And Max Levchin had this line about how Luke is one of these people that can walk around and he sees $1 bills on the ground, but they're only visible to him. And so Peter has this ability to actually get at like, what is the thing? What is your thing that's like, that's your superpower? And then more importantly, for a few of the folks, what they played back to me is that he would make them believe in that superpower. Right. So, yes, he has a hedge fund. He's investing, but there were a lot of people who were investing in startups at the time. I think the difference is that he has a nose for talent that is a cut above where some of his peers were.
Right. Yeah, no, I think it's great stuff. I never saw any of this before. And he gives such a phenomenal dimension to all of these people in this. And before we go, I just want to touch on one thing is this drive that they have, it's not a money drive, obviously, because they make a lot of money. What is it that they really believe that they're going to change the world every time they do something?
I think, so remember, my book it's about 200 plus people, right? And so I think I would be speaking out of school if I said it was one thing. I think for each person that I wrote about, it's like a different drive or motivation. I think for someone like Elon, there's a vision about what technology can accomplish and what you can do with technology that he sees very clearly in his mind. And then the point is just affect that vision, getting to Mars, making electric vehicles great and cool and increasing their production. So there's that sort of thing. I think for someone like Max, Max just says to me and has said at other places, I just like building companies. Like I don't know how else to say. I'm just a guy who likes to build companies, and I'll keep doing that as long as I can. Right. For David Sachs, I think he came into this story out of McKinsey, and he really got right away. Like, no, the point, like we want to build useful products for people. Like the whole point of this is like people have to be able to use this thing. So we got to ditch this Palm Pilot thing, which has a ceiling of 5 million users, and go to the email thing. For Reid Hoffman, I think Reid had always wanted to become a public intellectual, and technology and the kind of discussion around technology became a place where he could really move the world, right? He could change the world in that way. So money is, I would say, look, money, there's no denying that these people, some of them have achieved this like outsized wealth. But I never found that it was the thing that was the driver, because, in a funny way, if it was the driver, they would have lived very different lives after PayPal. Because after PayPal, a few of these folks had enough wealth where they could have just sort of like, moved to a beach and lived out their days. They continue to invest to support each other, to find promising new people, right? And then support them along the way. So I think that the motivation differs from person to person. So I think it's really hard for me to say, like, here's the motivation. For Ken Howery, a great example. Ken's actually an Eagle Scout. He was, I think, the only Eagle Scout I interviewed. He has a really deep conviction about public service. So he was named an ambassador in the last administration, and he wants to give back, and he does. And so there's just, the motivations are different, but they share hopefully some of the qualities that you and I just talked about, a desire to learn, a certain competitiveness. And I would also say humor. I mean, my interviews with these people are pretty laugh out loud funny.
You've had the fortune of spending, I don't know, was it 4 or 5 years to put this book together or so?
Yeah, it was 5.5, maybe a little
years,
longer.
right?
I'm kind of embarrassed saying that out loud, to be honest with you.
You really had the privilege of going to school on hundreds of people, very successful people. What did you take away from all this? What did you learn how it affected your life?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one way that it affected me is I broadened the kind of reading I do. I found that the people that I was meeting with were able to quote the Bible, then could quote some tech thinker, then could reference like a movie from film noir in the 20th century, and then reference something from the encyclopedia. And I just remember, like, honestly, like I never in my life had felt like the B student talking to A students, right? And so it forced me to say to myself, like, am I reading widely enough? Am I absorbing enough information that's outside of the things that I'm like totally obsessed with? A good example is that Max Levchin is obsessed with Akira Kurosawa's Seven Samurai. He has seen Seven Samurai over 100 times. It's like one of the great films of the 20th century. I confess, I had never watched it until I started this project, right? But his love of film, I was started to make, like, I made a list. I was like, okay, I really need to like watch these, like, this one, Citizen Kane and like all these like major films. I found a level of broad-mindedness that surprised me. People tend to think of Silicon Valley as like this narrow place. It actually, like, the people at the top anyway, some of the people I interviewed, were pulling cultural references from all over. So that was one thing, is that it broadened my kind of whatever. The second thing I would say is we have a tendency sometimes to look at competitiveness as a negative thing. Competitiveness can bring out your best. And so I kind of started to reframe in my mind. Like, I met people who were competitive, but they weren't like viciously competitive. They were just like competitive and they wanted to do their best. I have a young daughter, and now it's okay. Like, I want her to win and I want to make it okay for her to win. But like, we're sort of like, I want her to have a little bit of that chutzpah, that drive, the sense that like victory is okay if you can do it fairly and in an honest way and be a good sport about it. It's okay to want to be the best, right? And so I support her sometimes when she says that, because I'm like, I saw that in Max and these guys are like, so that was the second thing. And then the third thing I would say is, the thing that made this story work is that all the people we just talked about are so different. And meaning, like, we talked about these people and they share some traits, but you wouldn't actually like pick these, like, they are sort of like the Avengers. Like, you wouldn't have constructed a team, but you wouldn't have known. I am more thoughtful about people in my life who are very different from me, and inviting them to be like, to call me an idiot and to say, here's what you got wrong. Because I think that is what I saw in this story. It actually took not just a Max, but a Peter and a Max. It took an Elon and a Reid Hoffman, and it took the 200 other folks who were around him, all of whom had like very different personalities, politics, all of it. They were so different. I've started to think about making sure that the people in my life are not just carbon copies of me.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And that's like a conscious thing. I think to myself, like, I'm so glad like these friends are so different than I am, because they can call me on my stuff when I get it wrong.
Yeah, no, it's when I was reading it, it's funny you mentioned that, because I was thinking of it as a symphony. Each one played a different instrument, but together they just worked amazingly well.
Yeah. Yeah. It wasn't always harmonious, but it worked pretty well.
No, but it wasn't, and you do bring that up. But to have the passion to work until, you talk about PayPal on Thanksgiving 1999, where Musk calls up everyone, you better get in here, we need you now, like, it's Thanksgiving, I don't really care. We need a backup, we need this. He's been working here since 5 a.m. He's tired, get someone else to cover. It was, it was just the way everyone moved together. It was like a wave.
Yeah.
It just, I can't, look, we'll sit here and try to dissect this forever, but there were so many different things. And I think even if you ask the players here, everyone will give you a different take on it. But just looking at it.
They definitely did. And, part of the challenge of the book is you can imagine the devil's choice decisions I had to make
to cut stuff
in deciding what to keep and what to cut. The amount I wrote is 3 times the size of the book you hold in your hand. So I cut out basically 2 books worth of material to try to have this be something that didn't feel like it was going to be a better doorstop than a beach read.
No, I'm just saying all the interviews. You interview one of these people for 2 hours. How do you only take 50 words? I would never want to do that.
Welcome to my last half decade's worth of challenges right there.
Wow, great. Yeah, okay, folks, the name of the book is The Founders, The Story of PayPal and the Entrepreneurs Who Shaped Silicon Valley, by Jimmy Soni. And I highly recommend it, even if you're not into tech, just if you're into being an entrepreneur, just being a business person. Reading this, I got lessons here of how to be a better businessman, how to deal with people. Like you just said, I picked the same thing as you did, is that there is talent out there. And if it's like me, I'm hiring just carbon copies of me. Hire people who are not me because they're going to fill the holes in what my weaknesses are. I know what my strengths are, so I'm going to go to people with the same strengths as I am. I got to get people who fill those holes and plug in where I'm terrible at. And I think that, it's just a really fascinating book, really amazing insight. I really wish you a lot of success, Jimmy. And you, by the way, I was telling you at the top of the show before we went on air, your writing style is really quick and breezy. So even though the book is 400 or so pages, a little more, it flies. It just kind of, I almost missed my train stop this morning coming here. You just keep reading. It's really well done.
Well, thank you so much. And I appreciate you taking time to talk about it at this level of depth, particularly for somebody who runs a business. It's useful to hear that it's resonating with you because I want it to be useful for people. I want to tell an accurate story, but I do think that there are lessons that these people have in their heads that if you ask them to write a book, they might not be able to articulate it.
Yeah.
But the fact that I was able to get it out of them, I'm glad that it's resonating.
Really great, man. Lots of success to you. Jimmy, thanks so much for coming on the show, man. I greatly appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Charles Mizrahi Show. If you're a new listener, welcome. If you've been listening for a while, we're glad to have you back. Either way, we'd love to know what you think of the show. Please leave a review if you listen on Apple Podcasts. Reviews make it easier for others to find the show. You can also see the video of the interview on the Charles Mizrahi Show channel on YouTube.